Now I want to go over some of the interest calculations that are defined on page 56 of the AAPL guide. And what I've done is I've kind of grouped these together by sort of type. So for example, when we talk about the different types of interest, we can talk about a surface interest, a mineral interest, and a royalty interest. And just to be very clear about what the distinctions are is if you own in fee simple absolute, that means you own the surface and the minerals of the property. So there's the surface interest, and there's what's below the surface, or the mineral interest. So if these are together, if you own a fee simple estate, you own both the surface and the minerals. But what we know can happen is the mineral owner can sell the surface to someone else. So you have one person that owns the surface and another person that owns the mineral. So in that case, it's real important to distinguish between what interest is owned. Do they own a surface interest or do they own a mineral interest? Now, to get a mineral interest, it would be granted in a mineral deed, or it would be granted altogether as a fee simple absolute. But there is another kind of interest that you can get that's called a royalty interest, and that is a conveyance by a royalty deed. And so a lot of times this is also known as a non-participating royalty interest. So you can say, I want to convey my interest in royalty only, and that would then create a royalty interest. That's one way you can get a royalty interest. Another way is that you can assign or can grant an oil and gas lease and retain a royalty interest. So for example, if it was a 1/8 royalty, then B would be the royalty interest owner and the mineral interest owner. So those are the different kinds of interest. Now let's look at the different names for leasehold. And I'm going to erase this one so we can have space to talk about the next one. And that is that there is a distinction in terms between the landowner who leases an oil and gas lease, and that person is known as a lessor. A lessor sort of rhymes with landowner. So that's one way I learned it in in law school, was that lessor rhymes with landowner. And you'll hear these terms used throughout your career. And so I just want you to understand lessor, lessee, and then lessee is typically the oil and gas company. Now another name for the oil and gas company is the leaseholder. So that is the person that owns the lease. That's the oil and gas company. If this oil and gas company assigned their interest to another oil and gas company, in that case, this oil and gas company would be the leasehold owner, even though this is the company that actually took the lease. So the question is, who has the right to drill on the land? And it's whoever owns the lease. So in this case, it would be assigned, and the leaseholder in that case would be the oil and gas company B. Okay? Now the gross acres in an oil and gas lease is the total number of acres owned, or the total number of acres represented. Let's say you have the northwest quarter. The northwest quarter is 160 acres. Okay, so that is the gross acres. Now, if this landowner only owned a 50% mineral interest in the northwest quarter, we would multiply this 160 times 0.50, or half, and that will equal 80. So in that case, 80 becomes the net acres, and 160 is the gross acres. So 160 is basically the acreage that we use in the oil and gas lease, and it's what the total number of acres is before there's any kind of reduction. Now, sometimes your gross acres and your net acres may be one and the same. For example, if this person owned 100% of the minerals in the northwest quarter, in that case, we wouldn't have to multiply it by this 50% interest. And so the gross acres and the net acres would be 160. But you need to know the difference, because if there is some kind of reduction, it's going to be a different number if we're talking about net acres. Okay, so now let's go on to what I call the money interest, and that is the working interest and the net revenue interest. So we'll go over those first. And basically, the working interest is what says who pays the bills. So before an oil and gas lease, before a lease, the landowner would own 100% interest in the working interest and a 100% interest in what we call the net revenue interest. That means if this landowner wants to drill a well, he's going to pay for 100% of the expenses and be entitled to 100% of the profits. Okay, that's before the lease. After the lease, the landowner is going to be entitled to 0 working interest, because they're going to give their working interest to the oil and gas company. So the oil and gas company is going to own 100% of the working interest. That means they're responsible for all the bills. The landowner pays nothing. The net revenue interest then would be whatever the oil and company, let's say the oil and gas company granted them a 1/4 royalty. In that case, the net revenue interest for the landowner would be 1/4, and the net revenue interest for the oil and gas company would be 3/4 interest, or 0.25 and 0.75. Okay, so it depends on what the royalty interest granted in the lease to determine what the net revenue interest. Okay, if we granted a 3/16 lease, for example, the landowner would have a 3/16 net revenue interest, and the oil and gas company would have a 13/16 to make a 16/16, a 13/16 working interest. So it's whatever is left once we pay that landowner. So that's the difference between a working interest, who's going to pay the bills, and the net revenue interest, what the profits are. Some people think it's easier to remember this as being the joint interest billing deck, who the working interest owners are. Joint interest billing deck, or some people call this a JIB deck. That is a pay sheet that's set up by the division order analyst that only shows what the working interests are. And then people like to think about this as a division order pay sheet, or a division order deck. And that's going to be a series of what the royalty interest owners own. Okay, so that's the distinction between working interest and net revenue interest. And when we talk about any kind of a royalty payment, that's known as a burden, because it burdens the working interest owner. So for example, the royalty interest in this case, 3/16, would be a burden that the working interest owner would have to pay. If there is a non-participating royalty interest owner, that is a burden that usually the landowner is going to have to pay. And if there's an overriding royalty interest, that's going to be a burden that the working interest owner, the oil and gas company, is going to take care of. So let me just show you just a couple of examples of this. And I'm hoping that you're seeing this is really not that complicated. It's just knowing your terminology. And I know it can get complicated when people are throwing it around back and forth, but I just want you to understand that it's really pretty basic stuff. So a royalty interest, as we said over here, can either be based on a royalty deed or the royalty interest in a lease. So it can be a transfer by a royalty deed, or it can be the royalty interest in the lease. A non-participating royalty interest is another kind of interest, and that is created only by a royalty deed. And the way it works is that, just as an example, let's say that the dad owns 100% of the minerals, 100% mineral interest. Okay, and he has a wayward son, and the wayward son is having difficulty uh, keeping up with his bills. So dad is going to give that son, that wayward son, a share of the royalty interest. Okay, he's saying, son, look, I know you don't have any money, but if I lease this interest, I'm going to give you either 100% of the royalty interest or a 50% interest in the royalty interest. Son has no right, no executive right to sign that lease. Son is only entitled to a royalty interest, and for that reason we call them a non-participating royalty interest, meaning they don't participate in the lease, but they still get a share of the royalty payment. And so that's called a non-participating royalty interest. An overriding royalty interest is if the oil and gas company says to their geologist, I'm going to reward you if you find a successful well. So in that case, we're going to grant you a certain percent of an override. So that means if the geologist is successful, or the broker is successful, or whoever you want to grant an overriding royalty interest to, that means that person, that entity, is going to be entitled to a royalty payment that is not what's in the oil and gas lease. So for example, lessee says, geologist, if you can find a successful producing reservoir, we'll give you a 3% overriding royalty interest. So like we said before, if the lessors, if the royalty interest on the lessor's lease is let's say a 3/16, that means the lessee is going to get a 13/16 net profit. But they're also going to have to pay this third owner, this overriding royalty interest, their 3% interest. So the oil and gas company is going to make 3% less than the 13/16. That is an overriding royalty payment. Note that it doesn't come out of the lessor's share. The lessor is entitled to their 3/16 royalty. It doesn't matter who the lessee gives an overriding royalty interest to. So a lot of times you'll hear people say that the working interest is burdened by the overriding royalty interest. That means the lessee pays the bills for the overriding royalty interest. So I just don't want you to get confused about that terminology. An overriding royalty interest, different from a royalty interest because it's something that's given over and above what's in the royalty payment, and the working interest owner pays that bill, not the lessor. Okay, so that's just some basic terminology, and I think this will be really helpful for you as we go through these next three calculations.